The story I'm going to share with you is called How the Butterflies Came to Be, the story of joy, a First Nation story. In the beginning, the Creator made the earth and all the creatures living upon it. It gave him great joy when he blew the breath of life into each and every one of them, into the birds, the animals, the trees and the plants, into the insects, into the humans, and into all the other living creatures that he had made, and finally into the earth itself. But as you can imagine, having done so, it made him feel very weary and tired. He needed to rest. So he made his way up the path through the forest to the spot where his hut stood. He went in and laid down, and he drifted into sleep. He drifted into the time of dreaming, and his dreams were vivid with color. When he finally awoke, he felt invigorated. He felt refreshed. He emerged into the open, and there he felt the warm glow of the sun above. He breathed in the sweet air. He looked all around him at the glory of the natural world that he had made, and this gave him great joy. The little things in particular that he noticed delighted him. When he walked along the path through the forest, a little black beetle scuttling in front of him across the path, a green snake slithering into the undergrowth, a squirrel chattering away at him there perched high on a branch in a tree. He felt good. Until he reached the village where the humans lived. At first, he didn't realize that not all the living creatures that he had created shared his sense of joy at being alive. When he entered the village, the children greeted him, running up to him, grabbing hold of his hands and pulling him along, laughing and full of joy and chatting away as they walked alongside. But as his gaze scanned the village above the heads of the children, he looked into the faces of their parents, the men and the women, and he saw no joy. All he saw was as they were working so hard to survive, to live, he saw they were full of woe and they were weary. And this troubled him greatly. He couldn't understand. Why didn't they share his sense of joy at being alive, his sense of joy at life itself? Concerned, he left the village. He carried along the path through the forest until he reached a clearing where the cunning woman lived. There he found her, sat outside of her hut, smoking her pipe. Her face was much lined. Her gray hair streamed over her shoulders, and she was much bent with age. But her eyes were alive, alert, and full of wisdom. They greeted each other, and the cunning woman motioned for him to sit next to her, which he did. And for a time they sat in silence, her smoking her pipe. But the Creator could not stay silent for long, for he was too troubled. And he then turned to the cunning woman and told her what had happened in the village earlier. What can I do? He asked her. How can I give them back their joy? The children have joy, but not their parents. Do they not know what it's like to be alive? What a gift life is. How can I give them back their joy? As he spoke, the cunning woman listened intently, smoking on her pipe. When he finished, she did not answer right away. She continued to smoke her pipe, and she was deep in thought. Then after a time, She took her pipe out of her mouth. She turned, and leaning forward, she looked deep into his eyes. What you'll have to do is give them back something that will bring back their joy, something you create. Go out into the world, gather up the things that you have created that please you the most, that you love the most. Mix them all together. Whatever you create, take back to the village and see how they respond. The creator smiled and he thought, wise words as always from the cunning woman. He thanked her, got to his feet, and left her. He continued along the path through the forest, leaving it and going out into the world. And as he did, he took a great sack with him. He flew to the oceans and plunged his hands deep, deep into the briny, cold, salty waters, and he pulled out a handful of shells dripping with seawater, iridescent, pearly white in color. Between his fingers was entwined a seaweed, glossy, and also there were the fish scales, golden and silvery. He then reached up into the sky, through the blueness, into the darkness, and pulled down the strands of silver light from the stars and the moon. He pulled down from the blue sky those colorful strands from the rainbows, from the blueness of the sky and the golden sunlight. All around in the air was sound of birdsong, which he plucked out. He plucked out the sound of bees humming, buzzing on a summer's day. He plucked out the sound of water trickling over stones and pebbles in rivers and streams. And then he swooped down over the meadows and scooped up the wetness of the morning dew. And from the air, he plucked out the scent of flowers, the fragrance. He plucked out the spicy scent of pine. He plucked out the pungency of herbs, lavender, rosemary, and sage. And he plucked out the scent of new grown grass. And with all the other things that he collected, the living things that he loved the most, that he had created, he put them into the great sack. And before he closed it, he blew the breath of life into it and then folded the flaps over and waited. After a time, he heard a stirring of life within. He opened it, and out gushed an iridescence of color. Butterflies swirling, thousands of them fluttering all around him like snowflakes in a blizzard. Bright colors of the moonlight, of sunlight, of the blues and of the rainbows, all floating around him, mesmerizing him. And he felt great joy just watching them. And then the butterflies grouped into a swarm and began to stream back to the forest, followed by the creator. And as they entered the forest, they entered the path, and they zigzagged this way, that way, this way, that way, before dispersing as they entered the village of humans. And there they were in an iridescence of flashing color. And the children were the first ones to see them, for they were there, squat on the ground, playing in the dirt with their pebbles, when a butterfly flashed before them, and they looked up, and they saw the swirl of butterflies, a swirl of color all around them. They leapt to their feet, and they jumped up, and they began to try and clutch and grasp hold of the butterflies, laughing as they ran around. And their parents, the women and the men of the village, well, at first they didn't hear the laughter of their children because they were too much into the mindset of work. But when a butterfly flashed before them, they looked up and saw this iridescence of butterflies fluttering and swirling around them. They heard the laughter of their children and saw the joy in their children's faces. And the adults, the men and women, they smiled. And as they did, it brought great joy into their hearts. And as the Creator saw that joy entering into the hearts of the humans, of the men and women, it brought great joy into his heart too. I hope you've enjoyed the story. Thank you for listening.